Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for making your way back to the main plenary after a successful opening that we all had this morning. We're appreciative of the fact that many of you want to continue to engage and, of course, network, which we strongly encourage you to do. But ahead of the next part of our session, we do ask that you freely join us in what will prove to be very interactive sessions that we have for the remainder of this afternoon. We're looking forward to your insights, your questions, and how you will probe much of the participants who will be joining us here today as we look to get into the practicalities of what was highlighted today. For many of you who were present, it was quite clear that there's a high-level commitment right across the spectrum from key partners globally, those represented in the room, and of course those who will continue to make their presence felt in the upcoming days, that as a region, as key partners within the Global South, commitments that have been made as well as key institutions that continue to align together, that the efforts to collaborate remain in place. And this is going to be further evidenced by the practicalities of how we make it happen. So, this next session, over the next 2.5 hours, we'll have 2 panel discussions where we'll prioritize a key theme on focusing how best we leverage public development banks in terms of their influence, seeking the right opportunities for action, as well as making this a pivotal year for sustainability. But what does that mean? In the next sessions, ladies and gentlemen, we have 2 panels where we'll get an opportunity to hear from those who are industry leaders themselves. From a plethora of various public development banks who will join us to share their experience, their practical insights, and most importantly, some solutions that we too can implement within our local environments. We're focused on climate change specifically and understanding how that does need to be locally relevant to the markets that we serve, especially in light of the shifts that have been taking place very quickly within our jurisdictions. So with that said, this first panel will be moderated by someone who is a highly experienced professional, especially when it comes to understanding matters of climate resilience and sustainability. Not only is it a passion point of hers, but something that she prioritizes in terms of policy. This is how she serves in a role as Director of Bridgetown Initiative and Special Advisor on Climate Resilience within the Prime Minister's Office within Barbados. Our moderator for this first session will be Dr. Pepukai Badule, who will join us on stage following our panelists as well, who I will introduce shortly. In this particular panel, ladies and gentlemen, I strongly encourage you as well not only to actively listen, but engage, because this is also where we'll hear from various representatives who will give us their solutions and understanding into the pertinent themes that we'll discuss as to how we move from practice to reforms. Actionable insights for an effective international financial architecture. These will be distilled, as mentioned, by the moderator, Dr. Badule Pepukai, but of course, she'll be joined by several panelists who will be joining her on stage in a moment. I'll introduce all of the speakers, following which we'll give them all a round of applause as they make their way up onto stage and have a seat in the chairs behind me to my left-hand side. For this panel discussion, the participants in conversation are Mr. Ambroise Fayole, Vice President of the European Investment Bank, followed by Mr. Thierry Deo, CEO of Meridian, Ms. Eku Sohei Eahen, who's the Secretary General for the Insurance Development Forum. In a moment, we will be joined by Mr. Pradeep Kurukula Surya, Executive Secretary in the UN Capital Development Fund, and Mr. Stefan Wintels, who joins us as the CEO of the KfW representing Germany. Please give them all a round of applause as they make their way up onto stage. A conversation that will be moderated by Pepukai, and most importantly, an opportunity for you two to engage as key participants. Again, a warm welcome to the panelists.
Go. Okay, we'll use that one. Thank you so much for the incredibly generous introduction. Thank you to everyone who's taken the time to come here this afternoon. This is the beginning of a couple of hours of conversation, and so we'll try and make it as interesting and as dynamic as possible. I'm delighted to have such an incredible array of panelists, and I think what we should do is dive deep in. We have 38 minutes, the screen tells us right now, so why don't we get going? Ambroise, rather than giving you a minute to do an introduction, let's just ask directly. So the EIB has done some tremendous work. I'm slightly biased. In the case of Barbados, we've had some excellent experience very recently with the EIB, the IDB, and a number of other development partners and banks, including commercial banks, to catalyze debt swaps, debt conversions. But moving beyond that, key is mobilization, and the EIB has made a commitment to mobilizing $1 trillion in climate finance and sustainable finance for environment and sustainability by 2030, which is a huge amount of resources. How optimistic are you that you'll get there, and what are some of the key conditions that you think must be in place for success?
Thank you very much, and thanks for your kind words, but I will come back to Barbados. So EIB is the Bank of the European Union, and as a Bank of the European Union, we are doing what we can to make sure Europe reaches its climate goal, which is to be climate neutral in 2050. And for that, we have taken the commitment to do at least 50% of our action to support projects that are favoring climate. And actually, we are at 60%. And we have taken the commitment that we would have the trillion of investment in the critical decade that ends in 2030 in investments favoring climate. And when we do a project, we have some leverage, which depends on the kind of projects, but on average, basically 3 to 4. And that's why we are actually pretty optimistic that we will reach the trillion. Because that means $100 billion or euros, that's more or less the same thing today, of investment mobilized every year. We are actually ahead of the target by end 24. And one of the reasons is that, to come also to the question how to reach that, we are using more and more guarantees to develop actually a higher speed of investments in renewable energy. That's what we want to do, because we want also to help another objective of Europe, which is to be energy independent. Now, what we do also in terms of innovation is to try to use new products. And there are two that I would like just to mention. The one is on Barbados. So it's a debt swap for nature that we have done with the Inter-American Development Bank and the Green Climate Fund. And the idea is to build a new wastewater plant in the south of the country, to use that to help the authorities build this, to have a buyback of a bond, and an issuance with the guarantee of a new bond that is then much cheaper. The difference helping to build this waste water plant that has two objectives. One is to reduce the pressure on marine, and the second is to help also giving water for agriculture. And the second initiative that we have launched in Europe, and this is also another objective besides guarantees, is also more partnerships. We have developed with the European Commission and with several development finance institutions that are here today, KfW, GDP, AFD, ECO, etc., a new initiative called the Global Green Bond Initiative that is going to help develop and de-risk a number of projects that are going to help implement in poor countries green bonds that will contribute to greening the economy. And that's also a way to support this objective of climate finance.
Perfect. I hope that's clear. Thank you so much. I'm actually going to come back to you on Barbados, and I'm going to take the opportunity to very selfishly push some of the priorities that we have within the Bridgetown Initiative and actually test them with colleagues around the floor. So thank you for that, Ambroise. Maybe going to you, Thierry. You bring a slightly different perspective, right? You're coming at this not from a large development finance institution, but maybe from a little bit more of a private sector angle. What do you see as we talk about the need for more cheaper, longer-term financing? We talk about the need for billions, trillions of dollars of investment. What do you see, not as barriers, but what do you see in terms of prospects for pipeline development? Often we hear that actually money is not the problem. The issue is that we don't have enough pipeline, we don't have ready projects, we don't have enough investment early stage in project development. Is that an experience that rings true for you? And if so, what do you see as some of the levers for debottlenecking?
Thank you. From my past experience of nearly 30 years of investing in infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure around the world and in emerging markets, I think it has come to me quite clearly that what investor needs to really scale up and mobilize, because this is what we really talking about, how many billions and trillions can we bring there versus the few millions that are going today. Three sort of areas and angle that I see where actually public development banks are essential. I think we should make it clear that there will be no private sector mobilization without the PDBs. And I think that, and I'm talking from the private sector perspective. And three, project preparation is one for sure, but investors think in three lines. What's the risk reward? How much work for how much do I get to invest? And what is my liquidity? And we can act on those three different things. The first, upstream side, this is where the collaboration with government and PDBs can actually really help increase the pipeline. We have a number of initiatives around that, the project facilities, but it's not just about money, it's also about capacity and people. So it's also important to support the development of capacity. For example, both Ambroise and I are supporting an initiative with the African Infrastructure Fellowship Program where we try to train government officials that are project leaders in their country to really know how to deal with private sector and do public-private partnerships. That's one example. It's not just money, it's also human capital that is quite important to deploy, and we need to keep at it because there's often way too little focus on that. The second, when you think about risk reward, is the theme is much bigger, but I think two things: that the de-risking elements and capacity of PDBs in terms of first explaining the risk to investors who don't really know it, and sort of matching reality to perception of risk that can be much higher sometimes. The type of de-risking instrument, guarantees, protections, enhancement that they can provide is very, very important in mobilizing this, but also another sort of soft initiative that I would like to mention is speaking the same language. We've launched with a number of MDBs, but the private sector led years ago out of the One Planet Summit, the Fast Infra initiative that is actually now putting out a label to simplify the reading of what sustainable infrastructure means for investors and have a common language so they can mobilize faster and in a bigger way around these type of things. And the last, because I don't want to take too much time and we can come back, is liquidity. In most emerging markets, when you invest in an infrastructure, you better be long-term because it's going to be very hard to sell. But even if you are long-term, many investors have their fiduciary responsibility. So liquidity is an important piece for them in terms of valuing those assets, in terms of being able to report to their trustees. And we do need to create, with the help of the FDBs, a market where these assets can also be recycled. Of course, you need to create the new ones, but you also need to be able to, at the end of the cycle, be able to tell people, by the way, if you build this, you invest in it, you operate it, at one point there could be a liquidity opportunity for you. And that's very important because investors that have low risk appetite will enter through that lens first before they go to the greenfield and upstream side. And the large ones typically want to go there.
I think that paints a very good picture of what different types of investors are looking for and what is needed in order to unlock the potential. Let's put it that way. So this is a difficult room because people are sort of peppered around, so we can't get a good sense of how many people are actually here, but it seems like a sizable number. I would hazard a guess that there aren't too many people from the insurance industry. If there are, could you raise your hand? Okay. So, luckily, we have Ekoswehi here from the Insurance Development Forum, and you're probably asking, what on earth are we doing with someone from the insurance industry, given that it's not exactly hugely represented in the audience? Prime Minister Motley, who I have the privilege of serving, has said more than once, and I will repeat it again, if it's not insurable, it's not investable. Ekoswehi, is that accurate? Firstly, and I'm going to add a second point to that because I'm pretty sure I know your answer. And that is, we often hear that the climate crisis is beyond what the insurance sector can handle, which would not be a good combination. So if it weren't insurable, it's not investable, and it's not insurable, then we're in trouble. What's your view from the IDF perspective?
Well, thank you very much, Pep. I'm quite disappointed. I have to encourage my colleagues to attend these events, right? So thank you very much, Pep, for that. And I think really two great questions. But I think that absence also speaks to something that is foundational when we think about insurance. I think that there is often, a sense when you talk insurance, oh my gosh, we don't want to hear this, right? And people forget that the insurance industry or the insurance system is actually quite an important part of the financial ecosystem in terms of facilitating, as Thierry has referred to, the flow of capital, financial stability, the resilience of households, etc. There's also the reality that on an annual basis, the industry contributes between 5 to 5.5 trillion in terms of insurance claims, pension benefits, payouts on an annual basis. And in addition to that, they also sit on 40 trillion of assets under management. What that tells me is that there is an incredible opportunity. And it's an opportunity because that picture, of those big numbers is balanced against the reality that when you talk about developing countries, we are talking about 2 to 3% insurance penetration rates. So the function of insurance that you see in more developed markets in terms of the architecture of supporting better understanding of risk, the perception of risk, the role that insurers also play as institutional investors is vastly different in the developing country context. So again, I put this out there in terms of a level set, in terms of the work that needs to be done, in terms of developing not only the solution space, the risk transfer tools and solutions that are needed to do all the things that we've talked about in terms of facilitating the flow of capital, but also to build those foundational capabilities that can support better governance around risk. And I put this on the table because part of the work that we have been doing within the IDF, and it's also in the interest of the industry, if we want to continue to see the development of better insurance markets, is the need to collaborate with the public sector. So as an institution, we are a public-private institution led by the industry, but also working with the public sector through the World Bank, the UN and others, to say how can we collaborate to actually build better markets and support better resilience. And that means investing in a number of key foundational elements, which is better risk understanding, issues around risk perception that came up earlier today. It also means, as I said earlier, expanding the solution space. And I'm quite pleased to refer to a program that we have with the AFD, which we call the Integrated Disaster Risk Management Alliance, where we are working with AFD and their clients, not only on the policy issues that their clients are contending with, but really thinking through what are some of the solutions that are actually needed when you look at state-owned enterprises, for example, right, that are, trying to invest in critical infrastructure and can't access the necessary infrastructure or don't have access to insurance cover for some of the things that they want to get done. And so there is a space there that the industry, I think, is very open to collaborating with the public development banks to see what can be done. But it also means coming out of our comfort zones, because the industry can't do it alone. They don't necessarily know these markets as well, right? At the same time, the development banks need to also be open to exploring what collaboration looks like with the industry. To the question that you raised in terms of the Prime Minister's comment, I think it is a sobering reality, right? Which is the sudden realization that when you do not have these markets, there is a profound implication. And it saddens me, honestly, the fact that, we have been talking about this issue of insurance market development protection gaps for decades. But the issue has only really risen on the agenda because of what we are seeing in Florida and in California. The reality is that solutions will be found in those markets, right? And so the sentiments expressed by the Prime Minister is an expression of frustration, is an expression of reality, but I also think it is an expression of a sense of urgency that we need to tackle this issue. To the second question that you raised in terms of climate, climate is a problem. You will never find within the insurance industry somebody that debates whether it is a reality or not, because the insurers are feeling it on their bottom line, right? And so this is also what is informing a lot of the urgency that we are seeing around the Insurance Development Forum, to find partners that we can work with to actually begin to do these things. If we're working in developing countries, as I said, build better markets. Same thing for developed markets. But it's also thinking about the other side of the balance sheet. As I said also, insurers are incredible long-term institutional investors, right? There is an opportunity there when you think about that capital. How do you unlock it at scale to address some of the huge financing gaps that we see around us? So I don't see climate is a challenge, but it's not insurmountable. There are things that we can do today, but it also just means investing in the capabilities to understand the risk and make the hard choices.
Thank you. It's hard to not be transparent, right? The Bridgetown Initiative is actually collaborating with the Insurance Development Forum with the view to actually coming out with some extremely specific recommendations and actions that the industry and others are willing already to put their necks on the line and take. And I think that's where we need to get to. $40 trillion in assets is not something to be laughed at. And if those assets are not appropriately leveraged, it's a missed opportunity, particularly at a time when no one's quite clear just yet how we're going to close the financing gap. So you spoke about risk transfer, and those who are most at risk and most vulnerable, they're typically those at the base of the pyramid, those in the far-flung markets that we don't see sitting in our nice conference rooms. For you. UNCDF works largely, maybe even exclusively, with those people who don't make it to these large fora. What is your view on what needs to happen now, particularly with cuts in aid, particularly with a very different view on how development is going to get financed? And what is UNCDF, if you have started to think about it, strategizing for the future?
Sure. Well, for the benefit of most of you who I'm pretty sure haven't heard too much of UN Capital Development Fund, you'll be surprised to know that this was actually set up in 1966, 1 year after the United Nations Development Program was set up. And the thinking at the time, it's interesting history. You have to ask the question, why did the General Assembly come up with this idea of a UN platform to effectively get involved in blended finance against a backdrop of the emergence of the Bretton Woods institutions? And I think the same logic that prevailed at the time is even more apparent today, and perhaps FFD has made that even more prominent, and that is that some countries are left out of capital markets. They are left out because they're early stage, they are risky, transaction sizes are too small, they have liquidity issues, they have risk issues, and so on and so forth. And it's really to service that cluster of countries, the bottom of the pyramid, that we otherwise think of, throwing grant money after grant money, that UNCDF exists. So effectively, the organization was always meant to go in and absorb risks upfront. Now, of course, that requires grant funding, and this is what we deploy. We deploy grants in the form of concessional loans or guarantees in order to be able to absorb the kind of early stage risk that others cannot. And in doing so, prepare the groundwork to effectively on-ramp these ecosystems to the larger, more established forms of finance that's out there. It's a completely under-leveraged instrument, which is why when I came in 9 months ago, I told my managing director, we got two options here. Number one, reform, the entire organization to really just fulfill this mandate, its core General Assembly mandate of crowding in capital into these markets, or effectively shut it down because you don't need it. I honestly think there is a massive need for it. And every conversation that I've been here today and my colleagues have been points to the fact that this sort of risk-absorbing instrument is required at the early stage. Now, to answer your question, in today's context, I think, yes, the world is changing, but it's also the case that there are many partners, bilaterals, philanthropy foundations that are looking to invest in these early stage markets. For us, it's not so much about the billions and the trillions, it's about how do we move the millions. Because when you're in Anjouan Island, in Comoros, or in my country, Sri Lanka, it's not large ticket sizes you need them between, I don't know, 500,000 to 15 million, but you need it today, not 7 years from now, not 5 years from now. You need that money to move quickly. And this is where we try and play our part to essentially, if I think of it as plug and play. Let's look at where the gaps are that others are struggling to fulfill and go in and support to unlock those kinds of opportunities. And there are plenty out there that I think provide a lot of hope that when it comes to unlocking domestic finance, for example, it's a critical element of trying to make the system work. I mean, if you cannot get domestic finance to flow, good luck getting money from outside the country, right? So start there, de-risk that, build up the national development banks, and help them to really advance on the cause that's needed, whether it's on climate or any other thing that you care about.
Thank you for that. And it's actually my note to segue into Stefan around national development banks and domestic markets. And I fully agree with you. If we're not, and let's call a spade a spade. I'm from a developing country. I'm from the Caribbean. Sorry, there's a lot of feedback. And I always say that if you can't get investment in your own country from your own country, then anyway, full stop. So with that as a transition, there's a huge focus on country platforms, country investment plans, country climate prosperity plans, whatever the title. The intention is country ownership. And the fact that we even have to say that is a struggle, right? Because countries should always have owned their development trajectory. But the good news is that there's tremendous backing around country platforms. And so the question then becomes, is it just to the country to develop the plan and own the implementation, or also to leverage national development banks? And so question from the KfW perspective, where you invest both at the international and national level, what is the future, not just of international investing, but what is the future in your eyes of national development banks? And maybe before you answer that, what, hands raised, what portion of this audience is from national development banks? Okay, that's not bad. That's actually way better than insurance. I think we're about maybe 25%, so this is good. So not just what's your view on their role, but how do we make sure that national development banks are also part of that country ownership and that country leadership from multiple perspectives?
Sure. Firstly, many thanks to the hosts, South Africa and Cape Town, and many thanks to Finance in Common for organizing this, because I think it's important, because we are at a juncture. We are at a juncture because we need to wake up for a new reality, and the reality is not necessarily nice if you look around the globe where development budgets are being cut. And hence the pressure is enormously that we are much better in leveraging private capital. We talk about this now for a few years, but I think the numbers which we have mobilized are by far not sufficient. I think this context is really, really important, because I believe after I moved from the private sector to the public sector 3 years ago, I don't see how the public sector is equipped to provide the financing. So therefore, this debate is very important. Our DNA as KfW, and we are the largest national development bank, is very much around the reconstruction of Germany after the post-war number 2. But we have developed into a global bank. We are operating in 80 countries because we had a mission to follow our industries and entrepreneurs, but we also had a deep SDG agenda as Germany. And I think Germany is contributing to a significant role to make the planet a better place and a more sustainable development. In terms of your questions, national development banks are also after increased scrutinies how we spend taxpayers' money. And therefore, we are in a wonderful position as a AAA bank with a huge balance sheet of almost 600 billion US dollars that we have access to capital markets, and therefore we are not as dependent as maybe others on taxpayers' money. That's a huge difference which we have, and we are a regulated bank, which I think is important. How you build institutions in country needs development. I personally believe very much in institutions and not in election cycles. We need solid institutions who survive that. Second point from my perspective, which is important, you need the alignment closely with the government on a longer term agenda. I don't think that you can do development finance. We have an election cycle in Germany every 4th year and change it. You need to build long-term partnerships, as KfW has done it over 77 years, relatively independent from the political agenda. And that is a huge plus from my perspective, and there's a lot of trust in the industry, development banks and multinational banks. And thirdly, regardless your size, regardless your background, I think you need to respect every partner at the same level. Right? This is not because I'm AAA, I'm better, etc., but sharing experience, how we can make this planet from a climate and biodiversity we haven't even touched, a much better place. But there is a lot we can do. Last point from my perspective: how do we align going forward the political agenda, national-wise and globally, with our agenda, so to speak? That is probably the biggest challenge. And the national development banks, together with the multinational banks, can play a very constructive roles because I think we share the same values. I'm spending a lot of time in the IDFC, the largest 27 development banks. This is a room with less politicians, with less politics, but focusing on how we have the highest impact with the limited resources we have. How can we learn together? How can we drive initiatives? How can we integrate the insurance industry? That's a big point. It's a big hole in this entire architecture, etc., etc. But we have an increasing role to play. I'm very convinced.
Thank you for that, and thank you for also emphasizing that these development pathways are a marathon. They're not a sprint. They do not align with election cycles, and frankly, in many instances, they're a decade plus, especially if you're looking at infrastructure. So with that said, and I'm just conscious, I don't want us to run out of time and not hit everyone, so I'm going to try and keep my comments short and ask you for some quick comments. So you talked about Barbados and the debt swap, and just for context, if we look at what it takes to cover the investment needs of a small like Barbados of, $10-12 billion over the next decade, debt swaps could potentially, debt conversions could potentially cover about 10% of that investment. What do you see as one or two key things that could help unlock the much more seamless rollout of debt conversions across a range of markets, not just the Barbadoses, but the Benins and the Bangladeshes of the world? How can we see more, not just from EIB, but from the market as a whole?
I would say it has worked in Barbados. It works in countries. It is complicated to implement. So it worked in Barbados because it was a condition for Barbados to make this investment. Barbados could not borrow more, basically. Fiscal space was really a problem. And it is a country that where you could have this kind of projects. What it requires is, so you really need to have fiscal space that is under pressure, but a project that can deliver room for financing the project that is really interesting from a development perspective. What it requires also is trust and reliance. and mutual reliance between those who are financing these kind of projects. And actually, I'm interested that we have done that with the Inter-American Development Bank. We've worked with them for a very long time. We have developed mutual reliance initiatives with a lot of multilateral in recent past. It is in Ukraine with the World Bank, EBRD, the Council of Europe Bank, and others on procurement. On procurement that works well. More generally, it is more complicated because we are all used to follow the processes that we are used to. And that's something that we need to work on to develop this, because it worked well in Barbados because we are able to rely on each other. The way we do that with public development banks. In Europe, we have a mutual reliance initiative with KfW and with AFD. And that allows to gain time, to gain money, because you don't have to, every institution doesn't have to redo the exercise of procurement or on environment and social safeguards, or the assessment of the profitability of the project. You rely on one of the institutions doing that, and the others taking on board what has been done by one of the three. So that requires mutual reliance, that requires confidence, and that is very helpful if you want to develop these kind of projects. But I would not say that what we have done in Barbados is something you can repeat easily everywhere.
Thank you. That's a very important point, and I think a very hard piece of news to hear at a time, and I'm going to be a bit challenging, when I think we need to figure out how to unlock. So certainly not an EIB, it's not a poke at EIB specifically, but you've said three key things. One is it requires trust. Trust often is built when you know your partners, but we have to get to a point where we're trusting countries as well to have leadership. So I think that's one. I think the second one is projects, and I'm hoping that as countries develop more clear and credible and viable investment plans, that the projects are specified. But then you also talked about this fiscal space and fiscal pressure, and there are dozens of countries that are under that chokehold. And so I would argue that maybe we have the ingredients here, but maybe moving away from debt conversions to you, Thierry, let's talk about what could be standardized if debt conversions are still challenging, let's say for now, to get right. So let's see how we get there. What are some of the one or two areas in which standardization or moving away from this case-by-case basis could make a difference from your perspective?
As I was mentioning earlier, the language can be standardized. Because investing in climate and development can be very complicated, and there's been a lot of efforts from MDBs and DFIs to actually converge in terms of what are the requirements, and also with governments. So that label that I was mentioning earlier is one way to bring simpler standardization, because the standardization always scares everybody, especially when you try to be too exhaustive. But the language in terms of what sustainability means and investable in sustainability means is quite important. A number of the products that exist in terms of de-risking are already standardized. They just need to scale up. If you talk about political risk insurance or breach of contract insurance from the MIGAs, the DFC or all, it's a question of scale and accessibility to standardize maybe the window for investors to access and countries to accept it as well, versus the struggle of going through a very long process to put those in place. So these type of things can be standardized. So there are already a number of de-risking instruments from the public development banks that exist and I use them systematically, which means they can be standardized.
Thank you for that. And maybe building on the point around de-risking and assuming that that is standardized, I wonder, to what extent is the knowledge and the data and the insights that the insurance industry sits on from a risk perspective standardized in this process as well? Are we actually leveraging this? Because I would argue that you probably know risk better than any of us.
I would say no, it's not. Well, let me manage that. Not enough. And this is precisely what I was referring to, right? Which is that we are living in a world with increasing shocks, but yet there is an absence of a discussion with the industry in terms of delving into that expertise to better support countries. So my reference earlier in terms of the base foundational capabilities that need to be developed is important, because that speaks to developing the architecture to support states, right? And for me, when I think about standardization, I mean, there are different efforts that have been, being explored on that front. We obviously have the debt clauses as an example in terms of, a pause on debt repayments that Barbados, I think, was very successful in getting the World Bank to adopt for certain countries. We've seen the BOAD and I think it was KFW do some really interesting things around shock responsive loans. But we're also seeing a lot more from an industry perspective, working directly with cities. For example, we have a program in Argentina working on flood risk, where there's a lot of learning that's occurring between programs in Nigeria, Ghana, Colombia, and Argentina, looking at flood risk. How do we understand that? How do we build better products? How do we get there faster and address the needs of these city governments? And I think, from my perspective, there are lots of areas where we can standardize, but we have to engage with the industry at an earlier point within the process. Oftentimes, it's an afterthought, right? And then you get insurers in the room and say, we want coverage for X, Y, Z, right? And within that process, you lose a lot of opportunity for informing risk reduction. You lose a lot of opportunity in terms of innovation, and you lose a lot of opportunity in terms of the flexibility or just, a better product at the end of the day. And so for me, my presence here, even though we don't have a lot of industry actors, is to encourage that. We are quite open in terms of finding ways that we can collaborate. And maybe a final point, one of the things that we've also acknowledged, again, looking at the other side of the balance sheet of insurers, is how do we also support investment in more resilient infrastructure? And one of the things that we kickstarted last year was a joint initiative with BlackRock to create an infrastructure fund focused on small, medium-sized projects, precisely to your point. It's good to talk, you can talk about trillions, etc., but at the end of the day, we also have to meet the needs of individuals. So we have to be willing to tackle those complex projects and think about how we get them to scale to facilitate the necessary investments. But I'll pause there.
No, thank you. And it's often easier to raise that 100 million than it is to raise the 1 million. Okay, so that clock has now gone red. So I don't know if we're going to make it to everyone, but I do have I see you're about to jump in. I have a burning question for you, Pradeep, which is, what do you feel absolutely must be achieved in FFT, at FFT4 this year?
Yeah, okay.
What's a non-negotiable?
Very quickly, because I see it has gone red. Look, I think a couple of points. One, we have to be better at risk sharing. And we all have different characteristics that I feel we're not really connecting as much as we should. Some of us are credit rated, some of us are not, some of us are borrowing, some of us are not. All of this really has to come together, number one. Number two, we do need innovative finance. I mean, mezzanine loans, guarantees. We need to bring these types of instruments to bear much more quickly than they are. Number three, I think it's really important, and we've talked a lot about it here, project preparation finance. It's absolutely key. Without it, we're not going to get anywhere. And finally, I think you really do have to ensure that you enhance NDBs to identify the kind of risk or revenue generating options that can actually make these projects a lot more sustainable over time.
Okay, I'm going to sneak in quickly. So one last point. I'm glad that you mentioned, Stefan, nature, because I think separating climate from nature is a fatal flaw. It's something that we don't believe in doing in Bridgetown. How do you bring nature further into this conversation, particularly at a time when climate itself is under question?
I'm not a scientist, but given the acceleration of global warming, a lot of people tell me at least that it's the loss of the biodiversity balance which is accelerating the trend. So this is clearly alarming, and the loss of biodiversity determines whether we live on this planet and not how we live on this planet. It's much more complex. It has much more dimension than CO2 if you simplify climate. And like climate, it's not a balance sheet item. So at least in Europe, we try to establish a CO2 pricing mechanism, but we have not a global mechanism. We are far behind on biodiversity, and therefore I think regulation will play a crucial role, in particular transparency and disclosure to many, many companies, that at least there's a much higher awareness who uses the nature and with which costs. I personally don't believe that the private sector will play in the short term, i.e. the next 5 years, a huge role. I think we need to prioritize, we need to be very realistic. I think biodiversity needs a fundamentally different approach. If we go with a CO2 pricing biodiversity model, there's a risk that we may fail in 10 years, and we don't have the time. And clearly the insurance industry could play a very good role in pricing these highly correlated risks. And at least, again, increase the awareness, because currently nothing has a price. That's the dilemma which we face and will continue to face.
Fully agreed, and now we're at negative points. I realize that we have another panel, but maybe just one last word for myself on that. And I think that in large parts, as you say, these are externalities that are not priced. Forget about the balance sheet. They're not even in the economic equation. And until and unless we look at natural capital in GDP, right? Which is, I think, an interesting perspective for us to discuss offline. And if anyone's interested in the topic, let me know. Then I think we will struggle to see it work its way into the financial equation.
Biodiversity is almost 50% of global GDP. So if you would be the CEO of this planet, you would ultra focus on the most important asset below your balance sheet.
And with that, perhaps we wrap up. Thank you so much. Thank you to the panel. It's been excellent.
I think our panelists deserve another round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Well done, Pippa Kai. Also appreciate it. Thank you so much. And I believe more than anything, this really set the tone for the follow-up panel discussion that we're going to have in just a moment. As each of our respective panels in the previous discussion have clearly highlighted, we certainly need to be aware as to how it is that we structure the financial solutions and financial architecture for this future that we need to respond to, building up on the themes of biodiversity. And if that makes up 50% of the global GDP, how are we adequately preparing for that? How does it speak to the new models and aspects that we need to be mindful of? And most importantly, how do we ensure that these are flexible and agile enough to respond to the threats and concerns that might occur within the times that we need to deal with? Coupled with that, insurance certainly came up as a major point, and perhaps that also puts us on a great footing to fully understand moving on from 2025. Moving on as we try to ensure that we meet the SDGs of 2030, how do we ensure that we create a vision for financial architecture fit to meet the Sustainable Development Goals? So today, our next panel, also joining us for a good 35 minutes, including various speakers, will help us distill everything we need to know from the financing and, of course, the economic structures of economies, how those play a role, understanding how the SDGs themselves need to look at alternative means of formulating ways within which there's ongoing inclusion of public development banks to ensure that we meet these objectives and targets. And most importantly, hearing from various representatives as to how it is that institutions are currently adopting these rules, regulations, guidelines within the mandates that they serve. I believe we will be ensuring that all the audio is quite clear. We don't want to make sure that we go back to 2020 where our mics are on mute. So as the technical team is making sure that everything is in line and in check, I'm going to introduce our second panel rather, to help build up on the themes that have been shared. I'll introduce all the speakers individually. They will join me by having a seat in the second chair to my left-hand side on stage within the order that I mentioned them. We'll start off with the first speaker who will be joining us, the Honourable Minister of Finance within France, Mr. Eric Lombard. He'll join us today. Ms. Tatiana. The Minister will be followed by Ms. Tatiana Rosito, who's the Secretary for International Affairs within the Ministry of Finance in Brazil. Please warmly welcome her to the stage. In the second chair, sir. Thank you, Minister. We'll be joined by Mr. Dario Scanapikai, who joins us as the CEO of Cassa Depositi in Italy. That is the CDP. Let me try that again. My Italian was not so great. Mr. Dario Scacanapico. Scanapico. Can I use my hands this way? Thank you so much. Please join us, sir. We'll also be joined by Her Excellency, Ms. Nados Bekele Thomas, who is the chair for NEPAD and the African Union Development Agency. Please warmly welcome her to the stage. And we'll also be joined by Mr. Mark Suzman, who joins us as the CEO of the Gates Foundation. Please warmly welcome him onto stage. All of our panelists as they join us for this critical conversation to paint a picture of what the vision for a financial architecture fit for sustainable development certainly looks like. Thank you so much to our respective speakers who have joined us on stage. Fantastic. We may all have a seat. So this is where things get interesting. As we heard from the previous panel, we certainly understand the lay of the landscape, the concerns and perhaps gaps and opportunities that have been highlighted have been shared, especially in terms of some of the levers we can pull at. Consider the likes of insurance, making sure that biodiversity remains a critical area of focus going forward, and most importantly, how it is that we need to enhance on the collaborative efforts and even the financial innovation that needs to take place. Each of our respective speakers have experience, in-depth experience, and of course solutions and perhaps even new proposals and suggestions that we can deliberate on and share as we look to ensure that fundamentally from this summit we leave with solutions. I'd like to start off though this particular conversation with the Minister Lombard of France. A great pleasure to have you with us, sir. And I'm keen to pick up not only on the themes that were mentioned by the earlier panel, but also what we heard in terms of the high-level commitment that we heard from the various leaders that were in the room. We certainly heard that when it comes to fiscal and monetary policies, all economies are very clear in making sure that we create an enabling environment that incorporates the role and function of public development banks. And that also speaks to finding unique ways within which they can prioritize SDGs, but also making sure that even borrowings are competitively priced and affordable. From France's perspective, and perhaps this also gives us a nice overview in terms of the challenges and opportunities that your ministry might face, when we take a look at the current economic climate, things are shifting really quickly. And climate and sustainability, as we heard from the previous panel, continue to remain a key focus. Help us understand when it comes to envisioning what the future looks like and how we unlock the potential of public development banks to incorporate SDGs. What are some of the challenges that currently exist? And most importantly, in terms of France, how are you looking to navigate the landscape?
Yes, so thank you.
Oh, let's make sure we've got you. Your mic's
Thank you very much for your invitation. Maybe I want to start with the birth of Finance in Common, because actually it's an initiative that has been launched by Rémi, whom I really congratulate for that, and who invited two other friends to open this initiative, the French President of the Republic, Emmanuel Macron, and myself. At the time I was running Caisse des Dépôts, which is the older public financial institution. And I'm absolutely amazed and thrilled by the success of this initiative. And really, I mean, more than 500 houses in the world, that is great. And that is coming at a very defining moment. As perhaps some of you know, I spent 24 hours in Washington, beginning of the week. Yes. I arrived yesterday night from Washington.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that, or is that off limits?
No, I can tell you that we had a meeting in the Oval Room with President Trump, a meeting between members of both government, and a press conference on trade development and Ukraine, and the conference has been public, of course. We are at a defining moment because what is at stake today is what type of development we want in the world. First, as France is concerned, we continue to push for an agenda of sustainable development. Climate change is something we have to face, and also of inclusive development. And in that regard, there are two ways to organize the world. Is confrontation, is conflict, is trade war, tariffs, and there is another way, which is cooperation. And all economists, when you compare cooperation with confrontation would demonstrate that cooperation is much more effective. And I think it's still an open debate. And by the way, this is a discussion we had in Washington. And obviously, finance in common is on the side of cooperation. And by the way, what France has been proposing in the G20 and tomorrow in the G7 is to continue to push for an agenda of cooperation. Yes. And I think that what finance in common is doing, with so many countries involved, with so many institutions involved, is to push for this agenda of cooperation. And in that regard, what is done here is very precious, and we have to push for it. And then the other element of it is the role of public financial institutions in the global development. And what has a huge value, you know, when I was running Caisse des Dépôts in France, we had demonstrated that when Caisse des Dépôts were investing €1 of equity, there were €7 of private equity coming jointly. Yes. And the role of the institution gathered in finance in common is to trigger the development. If you look at the amount needed to develop developing countries and to face in all countries climate change, we are speaking about hundreds of billions of euros. It can be only managed by state money. It can be managed by public institutions, working jointly with the private sector. And that role of engaging in the important and structuring project is absolutely key. And for that, I think what is represented here is really the way forward, a way of cooperation, a way of sustainable development. And France will always fight for that type of development. That is at stake today, and I think, again, it's a defining moment, and everyone has to push in that direction. Thank you.
100%. Thank you so much, Minister. I think the messaging is really quite clear then that we are moving towards collaborative efforts and again navigating the environment where we might see some of the pressure points. Coming back to some of the themes that you've mentioned, and perhaps Ms. Rosita, I can come to you here, especially where it comes to the acknowledgement of climate change as a major concern and challenge. Given that you work for the Ministry of Finance in Brazil, Brazil, as we know, has certainly held and started off a clear focus on making sure that we do address climate change in previous conversations and platforms that have been offered. We're also making our way to COP30 as well, which Brazil will play a very pivotal role in. I'm keen to understand your observations representing as a country in Brazil in terms of the incorporation of sustainable development goals and how that aligns with climate change and the financial structures in place. What have some of the lessons and learnings been that you can share with us today?
Thank you. It's my pleasure to share also the stage with you and the panelists today. It's good to speak after Minister Lombard because we're always in agreement, and I just echo what you have just said. Like there in G20, this is a great platform, and we have been witnesses as well as participants of this platform, and we wish you long life. In terms of the SDGs, new instruments and platforms, and climate change is very much at the core of Brazilian priorities, and it goes together with combating hunger and poverty, and also to make this possible, reforms of the international financial architecture, which I guess is also the title of our subpanel. And those were also the three main priorities of the Brazilian G20. Yes. And as you just alluded to, the SDGs we know, unfortunately, are very much off track, right? So, but it's not only a question of management, it's also a question of resources and of resetting, reinventing this whole agenda. I think we had a great opportunity to work together with G20 members, with partners, with the civil society, with the private sector last year in a very interesting and consistent agenda whereby we explored all different levers for that. I don't think it's not possible to concentrate for the amount of resources that we're speaking to mobilize. And, just reminding us that now on our way to Belém, and we'll still pass through financing for development, which is also a very important milestone. But we have to reach 1.3 trillion by 2035, yes. Right? Ideally, what we have to do together, and despite all the challenges, and the challenges that multilateralism and development organizations face at this time, I don't see, especially in the world and in a team with such externalities, that we could not do it together. Yeah. So we'll have to figure out, and I think we have set a good stage for that, in different areas. For example, with the MDB's roadmap, which still enjoys very much support and is being implemented by MDBs. With the optimization of multilateral investment fund climate funds, it's really an area where we have, and despite all the challenges, we'll have to channel much more resources, private mobilization of private capital, and country platforms you alluded to. We think it's a very powerful instrument for that. We just had a forum here also that ended yesterday as maybe a preview for also this one, where there was a very rich exchange on country platforms. Yes. And Brazil is now experiencing, also as a result of our G20, and this was a theme that was very much part of the task force on climate, but also the MDB's roadmap, that we have developed a new generation platform. Yes. And as we speak, we are working with our partners. So it's a very, it's really a way of dealing with or bringing global financiers also to the local markets to finance projects that are, first of all, aligned with the great, the national development strategies, the ecological transformation plan, and the climate plan, that is, all the climate plans that base the achievement of our NDCs. Mm-hmm. So this has been, it is flexible in nature, it is government-led, and really connects. And the idea is that it's a locus where we can together explore and have the experience and the knowledge in one place to do blended finance with all its richness in terms of instruments, using multilateral banks, climate funds, but also new instruments in terms of de-risking, guarantees, foreign exchange risk mitigation. We could talk further later, but it's really one of the most powerful instruments for that.
100%. Ms. Rosito, you've raised a lot of points that I think are so relevant to where we'd like to take the conversation going forward. And I do acknowledge that Your Excellency is present with us to ensure that we are able to actually dig deeper into understanding that as we might be delayed in meeting the targets for 2030, we do need to unlock so much more capital. But I'm aware that one of our guests is under pressure for time. Mr. Suzman, in 15 minutes, you actually have to leave. So I do want to perhaps shift the conversation to you slightly, just to share your contributions to this conversation, especially when it comes to several themes that have been mentioned. Private sector participation, capital, money. It's been mentioned in the previous panel discussion. It's been mentioned by two of your colleagues here on this particular panel. And I think you represent a very intriguing part of the ecosystem where there's an intersection between philanthropy, of course, partnerships with public development banks, and most importantly, trying to ensure that you make an impact when it comes to sustainability. I'm keen to hear your thoughts on the evolution and the inclusion of private sector players like yourselves within the circle of making sure that we meet our SDG targets in our economies and prioritizing new models in finance.
Well, thank you very much, and apologies in advance to my fellow panelists that I do have to leave in 15 minutes for official meetings with our host, the South African government, which is what I think I will respect their timing. But I really did want to be part of this panel and on the stage because I think the questions you raise are incredibly important. And I want to link it to the theme of its finance in common to what end? And the end of development is an abstract phrase which today is significantly under challenge and under debate in many capitals around the world, not least in the United States, as Minister Lombard talked about, which is the country we're based in. But it's common about human impact, ultimately. It's the planet we live in, it's the opportunities provided for the poorest and most vulnerable, and that's the lens that we take as a grant-giving foundation. We're an unusual entity for it because we don't lend, we give grants, but we give grants at scale. Our annual budget this year will be $8.75 billion US in grant financing. And it's aimed in areas like agricultural development, healthcare, financial inclusion, all towards that human impact lens. But we know we need leverage. The way you get leverage is through the partner entities that are gathered here in this room and at this event. And it needs to be leverage that is very focused. I completely agree with the point about blended finance, but I often worry at events like this that the term is used so generically. Blended finance must be a good thing. And I should say, you need to really break it down by sector, by target population, by target group, by target community, because the answers to way to do financing are going to look different whether you're doing a sanitation project in a particular area, an agricultural project in a particular area, a financial inclusion project in a particular area, and you will need a different kind of set of partners. And certainly for an entity like us, we are very keen to be able to use our grant capital to help buy down and produce additional concessionality and leverage. And we actually have a couple of great partnerships with AfD, excuse me, our hosts and conveners of this event that showcase exactly that, where we combine our resources and work in countries from Kenya to Pakistan to be able to actually leverage a greater amount of resources in a more targeted way with very clear metrics at the outcome. And I think that's really, if there's one message I really want to leave as part of this discussion, is as you think about the full range of activities, investments, and clearly the sustainability, gender, and climate is critically important. We tend to focus a little bit more on the climate adaptation side because it's the poor farmers, particularly in rural areas in tropical countries, who are already most affected by climate change and need tools now, not 1 year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, but what are the tools by which we can provide finance that provides them opportunities to grow more productive crops, livestock, enter into global markets, earn income. And so that connection of leveraged finance towards an end against common objectives which are embedded in the SDGs, which, yes, we may be off track of the SDGs for reasons we're all well aware, but they remain a collective commitment by every government in the world to every citizen in the world about the shared prosperous future that we all want to be part of. And unless we are able to provide that financing, it simply will not happen.
100%. I will come to a few of your colleagues on the panel in just a moment, but I'm so intrigued. As you've mentioned, the market you serve is largely the vulnerable of the most vulnerable, largely within rural areas across the continent and the world at large. I'm intrigued by the commentary around insurance and covering risk and risk-adjusted outcomes that we're looking to attain. How much of a role and function does that play within the model that you're using at the moment to ensure that in as much as we're looking to drive shifts and changes from a sustainable development point of view, that we adequately accounting for risk where largely these are individuals who have heightened exposure to these
Let me use just one sectoral example, which I touched on, but is the agricultural development sector. Because I think that is one, it's the largest employer. Let's just take on the continent of Africa, more people are engaged in agriculture than any other activity. Yet there is a big shortage of capital that aggregates and supports capital, even under large-scale commercial farming, where there are massive opportunities available across large parts of the continent. It has more unused farm. But part of it is because the tools that are taken for granted in other parts of the world Brazil is actually a great example of agricultural transformation over the last 20, 30 years, is can you provide tools and techniques? For example, we provide support through digital soil health mapping tools that become public goods to help better target fertilizer and irrigation. That helps de-risk investments and pooled investments for aggregated smallholder farmers, which then should, in a logical marketplace, be reassuring lenders that there is actually, particularly if you're lending over multiple years, there is going to be a return. We have demonstrated, we have multiple projects that demonstrate you can get marketable returns at scale, and we want to use our, in this case, grant capital to provide the concessional tools to prove that. But then the key is the replicability and the sustainability. Yet that remains a sector that, to be honest, even in the DFC space, I think most of you will acknowledge in your different portfolios is a smaller portion of your portfolio than I believe it could and should be in terms of both its economic impact and its human impact. So that's just one very concrete example.
Perfect. Mr. Skanapiko, I'd like to come to you to get your perspective and feedback, because what we are hearing is that we are thinking of solutions from an innovative point of view. We are looking at the multiple layers that might exist in terms of our response to ensuring that we've got the necessary partners on board to address the SDGs, and that some of the solutions are practical. They're already being implemented, and we've got the partnership and participation of other key stakeholders. We'd like to understand how you're doing it when it comes to Italy specifically, because the institution you lead, sir, is exactly established for that. A commitment to use savings in the country deployed towards outcomes and capital investment that speaks to the SDGs. Help us understand how successful you've been so far, perhaps some learnings that we can also discuss further here on this particular panel in terms of the outcomes as we paint a trajectory to what the future needs to look like.
Yes, many thanks, and also thanks for the organizer. This is really a great event, and is such a good opportunity to exchange point of views. Now, you know, Cassa Depositi and Prestiti is 175 years old. It's a very old institution, even before the unity of Italy was done. And since then, we have always supported investment, mainly in the rural area, because 175 years ago, Italy was not very much different from many countries in this continent. So since then, I think the model has worked. I mean, we try to collect money from the private sector, because, I mean, who provides our money are the financial market and retail investors through the postal savings, and we employ them both in Italy and also outside of Italy. Outside of Italy, we always play together with our partners. I would like to reassure, I've heard a lot of times today that we should increase cooperation. Clearly, we are not where we should be in terms of mutual reliance, something that was mentioned in the former panel, in speed of action, in alignment of financial policies and financial instruments, but the cooperation on the ground is good. So in a certain way, I think that there are a lot of the experience that we've gained in Italy throughout 175 years of history that we can apply here. And again, the one of cooperation, of involvement of other players is very important. Today we were talking a lot about the role that you know, institutions such as National Promotional Bank can play. And there is one image which to me is the most relevant, is a bridge. Mm-hmm. The bridge is the only you know, product of engineering that doesn't divide, but brings together, you know, two sides of a river, people from different sides. And we are a bridge because we are a bridge from public budget to private investors, yes, to private financiers. We are in the middle as National Promotional Institution. We can provide you know, risk-absorbing instruments from the public budget of Italy or of the European Union, and having this instrument to the risk, and then promote the intervention of other private players. But we are also a bridge in the way that Stefan Winters was mentioning before, having a long-term view which you know, outpaced the political cycle. We have a long-term approach, and we have a lot of fora in which we discuss as long-term investor or what we can do together. So in a nutshell, the role of National Promotional Bank has proven historically very valid, mm-hmm, and in the field of development, I believe that we can do a lot. Just a few words. In Italy, we are the manager of a very important instrument, which is the Italian Climate Fund. By the end of the month, we will have approved projects for a total of around €1 billion. And we never do support projects alone. We always team up with other players, bilateral and multilateral partners. And we believe that this is the method on which we should build on.
100%. I'm so intrigued because this does tell us that the commitments are there, the partnerships are being forged, some of the success is being witnessed. Your Excellency, I might have broken protocol by keeping you to respond last, but I did this deliberately so that you could hear the observations and the feedback that you're hearing from many of your peers, because what it does highlight is that the commitment is there, the solutions are being brought to the fore, the experience and even the political will and the ambition is there. However, we still remain off target in terms of the goals and objectives we set regarding the SDGs by 2030. I'm keen to understand from your perspective, especially when you look at this from the African point of view, what more needs to be done to not only ensure that we have locally responsive solutions on the ground, but that we're able to add a catalyst to fast track the development that we need from an SDG perspective.
Thank you very much. First of all, for those that do not know, the African Union Development Agency is a development agency that's based on the NEPAD, the New Partnership for African Development, which is the spirit that is guiding, the development agency in general. And this premier development agency is created to coordinate all development activities in the continent, monitor and mobilize resources, the required resources for the implementation of, the priority programs. Yes, it's very interesting for me to be sitting the last 2 days listening to what, is said about financing, the need really to meet the SDGs. But I would like to say that for us in Africa, the SDGs were informed by the Vision 2063. Mm-hmm. So, our Vision 2063, which is our blueprint, guides our work. And the SDGs are actually 100% contained within the Agenda 2063. So meeting the Agenda 2063 is really like meeting the SDGs. So I want to clarify that, yes. And therefore it's one and the same. And in actual terms, for the UN and the AU, the African Union, we have realized that although there are two agendas, the SDGs and the Agenda 2063, we have one implementation plan, which is the 10-year implementation plan. Mm-hmm. And that's where we have stipulated all our big priority programs, like the infrastructure program, industrialization program, the agriculture, the CADEP, yes. which is in there. And all these really require massive investment, massive investment. I mean, the 10-year investment plan that we have put in place has a gap of $3 trillion for the 10 years. Why? Because although the total amount, the costing of the total 10-year implementation plan is $8.3 trillion, we made sure that the $5 trillion are already contained within the development plans. So there is an alignment between the national development plans and the 10-year implementation plan. And also the regional economic communities plans are also aligned. I'll come to your question, to our second 10-year implementation plan. It's very important to understand that, because at the planning stage, we are coordinated. There is harmonization, yes. and there is just one plan. Then, we need to have all the financing institution also to align mm-hmm. their finances to the priority areas that are already stipulated in the second 10-year implementation. And that's where I would come. And I've been hearing all the discussions before. I guess, we have an issue in terms of the NDPs. The NDPs are really the vehicles to drive these big investment yes. vehicles for us. They're important and we need them. But, we have got 95 plus, NDPs in Africa, which is 21% of the whole entire development banking in the world, but with 1% asset 100%. Of the world. And therefore, capitalization is of great importance, and de-risking is very important. And then, just to articulate on that, and these NDPs need also to have a coordinated, approach, and we have got so many of them fragmented everywhere, and that is not only the development banks, it's also from the climate financing. Exactly. We have got many instruments, but they are all fragmented, and therefore we need to have a coordinated, and really organized way of responding to the priority areas of Africa, and that's where,
100%, and I completely agree with you there, Minister. I do want us to acknowledge that Mr. Salzman does need to leave because he does have an urgent meeting with the South African government, Mr. Suzman, as he's mentioned. But it does take us to an opportunity as well just to build up and conclude on some of the key themes that need to be mentioned by all of the panelists as we do conclude and primarily focus on the outcomes of what has been mentioned, which is the vision for financial architecture fit for sustainable development. And I just want to give each panelist at least 15 seconds to tell us what is the one commitment to ensure that as we move forward from the conference, which will end in 3 days' time, there's an outcome that we can attain in a year's time that would have shifted the dynamic in terms of attaining sustainable development goals. So what's the one thing perhaps that needs to happen from a fiscal point of view, government, institutions, and policy to make sure that we shift the radar? 10 seconds each. Minister?
Maybe 15 seconds. I think we have to work on the financial governance of the world. So 20 seconds. And that it is important that we continue to promote multilateral institutions, IMF, World Bank, multilateral development banks. And in that regard, let me repeat how important finance in common is, because that put together more countries, or almost as much countries as the UN, with very powerful institutions. And we have to continue, and Remy, I count on you to continue to lead that marvelous initiatives.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. If we have your perspective in 15 seconds.
Since 15 seconds, so let me concentrate on new generation platforms, such as the Brazil Investment Platform, because they should be government-led, aim at economy-wide, and be a locus not only for projects aligned with programs, but for information and connectivity, so that they are able, as Mark just said, to cater for different sectors and phases of projects. And they rely on national development banks. In Brazil, it's settled on the BNDES. I would like to conclude with that.
And two. Thank you. Dario, your perspective in 15 seconds.
3 points. First, climate financing will remain there, despite the fact that it's not very popular at this point in many parts of the world, simply because the climate is changing. Second point, cooperation among us needs to be improved, among bilateral and multilateral. Third, a key aspect is the involvement of local partners, because in this way you allow sustainable growth.
100%. Thank you so much, sir. Your Excellency, very briefly, the one key objective we need to work towards in 15 seconds.
Well, as the African Union, we have got 3 major initiatives to really make the institutions fit for purpose, the financing institutions. There is this proposal for the creation of the African Monetary Fund, which is very good in terms of, addressing the imbalances on the balance of payment. There is also the intention of creating the African Central Bank, which is also very important in terms of the ultimate goal is to have just one currency for Africa. Sure. That would really help us de-risk. And the third one is the credit rating agency, which will really lower the cost of capital for Africa. So 100%. These are the 3 instruments that we would like to put in place as 100%. We go on in the future.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. They all lead to very robust debates that do take place, but ultimately from a policy point of view, we certainly see the outcomes and objectives. We certainly do see the practical examples as to how it is being implemented within different countries and regions, and most importantly, making sure that despite the uncertainty that might exist within the respective markets we operate in, we continue to work within a manner to attain camaraderie and partnership right across the spectrum. Please give my panelists a round of applause before they leave the stage. Fantastic. I do understand that as we do conclude this particular session, there will be a photo opportunity with the various partners and previous panelists from the discussions that we had earlier. They'll be joining us on stage for a photo opportunity. You, on the other hand, can not only stay and join, but most importantly, do make sure that you continue to follow through with the details on the program that are available to allocate yourself to the conversations that will be taking place tomorrow here in the main plenary, but also on the sidelines. two of my colleagues, Jimmy Moyaha and Stephen Grotes, will be guiding you through many of the plenary sessions that will be taking place over the next 2 days. But it's quite clear. The objective is for us to partner, align, and of course make sure that we meet the objective of investing into critical infrastructure. Thank you for joining us on day one. Our panels, number 1 and 2, will join us for a picture opportunity. So if they are still present, please do join us. To the rest of you, ladies and gentlemen, have yourselves a wonderful day. Thank you so much.